FM News Talk 97.1. On demand audio.
Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Mr. Malcolm, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. What's your initial reaction to what we've now seen as a hung jury and a complete acquittal in this Baltimore situation?
Well, I can't say that I'm surprised. I mean, there certainly seems to have been by the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, a real rush to judgment here. She brought these charges without using a grand jury right after receiving a police report and an autopsy report. There is some suggestion that she may have gotten the medical examiner to change his report from a ruling that this was an accidental death to homicide. Look, when prosecutors, and I was prosecutor for a number of years, when there are separate trials ordered, you usually go with your strongest case first because it increases the likelihood you'll get guilty pleas or convictions in the later cases. And so things are not going well for her, to say the least.
So the second officer opted for a bench trial.
Right. My
suspicion is the next four might do the same thing.
Yeah, no, they very well might. So the first trial against William Porter ended in a mistrial, and there's been some speculation. Look, there were a lot of riots following Freddie Gray's death, and there was a curfew imposed and looting and arson after the funeral. Mosby went out there and said she was responding to protesters who were shouting "No justice, no peace," and basically saying that the only way that this young man was going to get justice was if these people were going to be convicted. And it only takes one juror to hang up a jury, either one who wants to convict when everyone else wants to acquit, or one who wants to acquit when everyone else wants to convict. So the pressure on these jurors who live in this community, after all, to do something, to find these officers guilty of something, must be great. And so, Edward Nero took his chances by saying, I won't have to put the state to its paces of having to convince 12 people that I'm guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I'll take my chances with an unbiased judge. And obviously, the judge said he found the defense's theory of the case far more compelling than the state's theory, much less finding the state's theory compelling beyond a reasonable doubt.
We're talking to John Malcolm from the Heritage Foundation. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they all colluded here, but I do think that the response to this has been very finessed so far. I heard a Gray family attorney praising the judge in this case, and then yesterday I heard Congressman Elijah Cummings say this.
There are always going to be people who are not going to be satisfied with the decision. But keep in mind, we also have 5 more trials to go. And so I have not read his opinion today, but I do know that he has looked at this case carefully and has made no conclusions when the case is still coming up.
I think these are talking points because I think what they don't want to do is hack off the legal community, the judges that are going to hear these future cases by overreacting to this case in hopes that they can get at least 1 or 2 convictions out of these remaining cases.
Well, it's possible. I mean, you don't want, the judge doesn't want to taint the remaining trials by saying one way or the other how they ought to come out. Some of the defendants are in slightly different positions. So Porter, for instance, the one that got the mistrial, was one of the 2 officers, the other being Alicia White, who was called to the van after it arrived and, was supposedly negligent, criminally so, in not calling for medical help. The next trial that's coming up is the driver, Caesar Goodson, the one who was just acquitted, yesterday or the day before. Nero was one of the 2 arresting officers, along with the third being Lieutenant Bryan, who was the senior officer on the scene. It's going to be very hard in one of those trials. The third officer who gave chase was Garrett Miller. Garrett Miller testified at the Nero trial under a grant of immunity. Despite that testimony, Nero was acquitted, and it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, for the prosecutor to separate out the evidence against Miller from his immunized testimony. So that's going to make I think these are going to be very, very tough cases for the state to prove. They probably shouldn't have brought these cases in the first place. But it certainly is not starting out well for the prosecutor against the driver or Lieutenant Rice. The more senior officers, maybe they can make a better case, but it's looking doubtful to me.
Yeah, that's true. You seem to have a closely watched this situation. I wonder if the chilling effect these charges have had on the police enforcement in Baltimore have continued, because immediately after this case, there was a lot of talk about a sort of a slowdown, if so to speak, among the police officers and a hesitation to make arrests and a spike in the crime rate?
Well, look, this is that would be horrific. You rely on officers to fulfill their duty. They have a very, very dangerous a job to do. On the other hand, I understand that they're looking at a situation in which there's all of this racial animus, and they're looking at a prosecutor who's going to say maybe a lapse in judgment isn't going to end up in a reprimand. It's going to end up in a criminal trial. I mean, in Baltimore, they had a record number of murders last year in that city's history, and non-fatal shootings were up 72% in 2015 over 2014. So you have a situation that is pretty much out of control, and they've got to get a handle on it, and fanning the flames of racial hatred are certainly not going to do it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. John Malcolm from the Heritage Foundation, I certainly appreciate your time today, and I'll direct people to the website there at heritage.org for the very latest.